Slurs should never be censored. They are ugly for a reason. Ugly words signal structural oppression. Euphemized race terms may seem neutral, but they enable the same systemic targeting. The apparent harmlessness of terms like black masks the latent danger of racialization, consequences which society has yet to fully experience. Racial slurs are offensive not merely because of personal insult, but because they encode the historical reality of structural oppression. Words like nigger reflect centuries of slavery, legal discrimination, lynching, and social exclusion. The offensiveness is an effect of systemic mechanisms capable of targeting populations based on race. Today, society attempts to sanitize discourse. Euphemisms such as black replace historically charged slurs. While seemingly polite or neutral, these terms have structural consequences. Unlike slurs, which no one would place on a legal form or census, euphemized racial categories are formally codified in government documents, censuses, and data systems, providing the state with detailed information about individuals' racial identities. The consequences are alarming. Euphemized racial categories carry latent risk, enabling potential targeting, surveillance, and oppression, tools that could be exploited under authoritarian regimes, especially as the United States is still, for the large part, of one single quote-unquote race. It makes it therefore very easy to target a minority, as there is a majority to enforce the rules and also a majority who can profit from this oppression. This essay argues that the true danger lies not in language, but in the structural codification of race, and that the censorship of slurs paradoxically obscures the very reason they were historically offensive. Slurs are offensive because of structural targeting. Historical evidence makes clear why slurs were and remain offensive. In the United States, the word nigger was used to dehumanize enslaved Africans and their descendants. Its meaning extended beyond insult to legal, economic, and social categorization, the framework through which people were enslaved, disenfranchised, and socially excluded. Similarly, during the Holocaust, labels such as Jew or Roma were used in bureaucratic forms, identity papers, and census records to target populations for systemic persecution. The harm was not in the words themselves, but in the state's capacity to act upon those classifications. A good example would be the Netherlands. In Dutch bureaucratic systems, every citizen had written on his passport whether or not he was a Jew. This made it very easy for the German occupying forces to locate the Jews and ship them to concentration camps. This is one of the reasons why the Netherlands has percentually the biggest amount of their Jews shipped to concentration camps. Before World War I, there were over 200,000 Jews, more or less, in the country. Afterwards, there only remained 30,000. Thus, slurs are ugly for a reason. They signal the existence of social machinery capable of selective oppression. Replacing slurs with sanitized language obscures the historical warning encoded in their offensiveness. Terms like black lack the explicit connotation of historical persecution. They are seen as administratively convenient and socially polite, making them ideal for inclusion in official documentation, censuses, and surveys. Unlike slurs, these euphemisms do not shock or alarm, which creates a false sense of security about racial classification. In reality, the sanitized language permits the formalization of race in bureaucratic systems, granting governments a detailed map of citizens by racial category. What was once a warning sign, the slur, becomes a latent hazard, the neutral label. History demonstrates the consequences of formalized racial categories. For example, apartheid South Africa. The Population Registration Act required all citizens to be classified by race: white, colored, Asian, or black. Classification determined every aspect of life: residence, employment, marriage, and education. The census functioned as a bureaucratic map for social control, enabling legal oppression under the guise of administrative order. In Nazi Germany, for example, Jews, Roma, and others were identified through census data, passports, and identity cards. Labels were bureaucratically enforced. They determined access to employment, property rights, and ultimately life or death. The Holocaust demonstrates how even neutral-seeming categories become deadly when embedded in state infrastructure. Another one is, for example, colonial classification in the Americas and Asia. European colonial administrations classified populations into racial categories to justify taxation, forced labor, and social hierarchy. The classification itself became a tool of exploitation, demonstrating the structural power of racial categories independent of any offensive terminology. These examples illustrate that formalized racial categories enable oppression, whether the terminology is slurred or sanitized. Race in the US. In the contemporary US society, euphemized racial categories are embedded in bureaucratic systems, most prominently the census. There's a near universal reporting. Over 97% of respondents report race on census forms. The census records name addresses, household, composition, and race for each person. Should an authoritarian regime come to power, this data could be cross-referenced with addresses, voting rolls, or other databases to identify and isolate specific racial populations. Even though Title 13 of the US Code protects individual census data, the structural capacity for misuse exists. History shows that bureaucracies can be repurposed for oppression once the political will aligns with authoritarian ideology. Modern algorithmic systems exacerbate the risk. Facial recognition and machine learning often rely on racial categories drawn from historical or administrative data. These categories are unstable, socially constructed, and historically loaded, yet are operationalized as objective data. The result? Technology inherits the structural vulnerabilities of racial classification. Slurs were offensive because they reflected a system capable of selective targeting. The offense was the effect, not the cause. Euphemized terms like black appear neutral, but they enable the same structural mechanisms while masking the historical warning signal. Historically, the word nigger indicated that the bearer of the term existed within a system that could oppress, enslave, or kill. Today, the term black allows governments to codify race in censuses, IDs, and data systems without raising alarm, while retaining the structural potential for oppression. The only thing you have to trust on for them not misusing this information is their word. This is highly risky. Thus, censorship of slurs is misguided. It hides the danger rather than teaching society why these words were harmful in the first place. The structural hazard lies in classification, bureaucracy, and administrative legitimacy, not in letters or sounds. The only way to neutralize the ticking time bomb is to dismantle bureaucratic racial classification. Eliminate race from IDs, passport, and most government forms. Use alternative metrics for policy, equity, and aid, such as economic disadvantage, geographic location, or access to services, attributes that do not embed social hierarchy based on appearance. Educate society on the structural dangers of racial classification, ensuring that historical lessons are not lost in the sanitization of terminology. Europe offers partial lessons. Past Holocaust legal frameworks, such as removing the word Rasse from German law and limiting racial categorization, demonstrates recognition of the structural danger. By contrast, the US continues to normalize euphemized race in bureaucracies, creating a latent hazard. Racial slurs are offensive because they signal the existence of structural oppression, not because of mere insult. Euphemized terms like black are less socially alarming but structurally dangerous, just as the word nigger was one day. Formalizing race in censuses, identity documents, and data systems. The US Census exemplifies this ticking time bomb. Nearly all citizens report race at the individual level, creating a detailed map of the population. Should an authoritarian regime gain power, this infrastructure could be exploited for surveillance, targeting, and mass oppression. Slurs should never have been censored. They are ugly for a reason, because they encode warning of historical and systemic targeting. Euphemized race words, however, neutral they seem, carry the same structural potential for harm, while society remains oblivious. The danger of racialization persists, and the full consequences are yet to be felt.